I believe that there has been more effort made in the cover-up following the murder. I think something terrible happened in that house.
John and Patsy didn't have anything to do with killing that little girl. And if they did, if it's proven that they did, I'll never trust anybody the rest of my life, because I never seen anything but a loving, kind, wonderful family.
We're dealing with someone who had access to the house, access to personal living knowledge.
For instance, I've always said the Swiss Army knife that I hid, put away in a cupboard, there's only one person that would have found it, and that was Patsy Ramsey, and they found it in the room where they found JonBenét.
What everyone knows is that this $100,000 reward is for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the killer of our daughter. We feel like there are at least 2 people on the face of this earth that know who did this.
Every word spoken by the 3 people in that interview seemed to carry a hidden weight. Were they truly speaking the truth they knew, or were they influenced, pressured, or even bought off by others? Looking back at that interview, it's hard not to notice the contradictions, the strange pauses, the guarded expressions, the carefully chosen words. There are moments that feel less like grieving parents speaking freely and more like people trying to carefully hide something they already know. They said the guilty would be punished. But do you really believe the Ramsey family is facing any consequences? Or have they managed to escape justice all these years? Let's revisit this case through a fresh, sharper lens here on crime cases. Most direct and powerful. Television. It's where many believe they can control their story. A brightly lit stage, where every word, every smile, every tear is carefully, meticulously delivered. But it's also the very place where their most vulnerable slips, their unconscious reflexes, are captured forever. As they stuck to the script, played their roles convincingly, everything remained under control. But they forgot one undeniable truth: words can be rehearsed, but eyes, gestures, and involuntary reactions cannot be masked. In what seemed like a flawless interview, where the Ramseys once again presented their familiar narrative of the misunderstood, perfect family, one of the most pivotal moments in this entire case took place right before millions of viewers. Patsy Ramsey, in her usual trembling voice, with her tear-streaked face, uttered a line that she herself probably didn't realize was dangerously revealing. We feel like there are at least 2 people on the face of this earth that know who did this. At first glance, it sounds harmless, even like a plea for help, a desperate cry for the public's assistance. But when you pause, when you really think about it, something deeply unsettling becomes clear. An ordinary grieving parent, desperate for justice, would only think about the killer, just one person. But not Patsy. She immediately included a second person, someone who supposedly was confided in by the killer. This isn't the kind of statement that comes from an innocent, desperate victim. It's the kind of slip that only happens when someone already knows, or at least has imagined exactly who holds the truth. The moment Patsy spoke those words, she froze. A brief pause, very brief, but enough to catch her eyes stiffening, her mouth slightly agape, her hands clenching involuntarily. A classic freeze response, the kind that happens when someone realizes too late they've said too much. And then, right at that moment, John Ramsey turned to her. Not with worry, not with concern, but with a look of warning. A sideways glance. Swift, sharp, calculating. And then, he clicked his tongue. Just a faint sound, barely audible unless you were watching closely. But for those paying attention, it was unmistakable, a silent cue. A non-verbal signal of frustration, annoyance, and most importantly, a reminder. In that instant, John didn't need words. That glance, that subtle click of his tongue, was all it took to pull Patsy back in line. Her face reset almost immediately. Her voice softened. She slipped right back into character, the grieving mother. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't a coincidence. That was the moment, the very moment, their carefully constructed mask nearly fell apart. Through his glance and subtle cue, John Ramsey revealed his true role, the orchestrator, the one in control behind the scenes. He wasn't a grieving husband. He was the director managing the performance, keeping his co-star on script. Even right there, under the blinding lights of national television. Throughout the entire interview, they deflected direct questions. They danced around answers, constantly repeating vague, empty phrases like, "I don't know," and "I can't recall." They never pointed fingers at each other. They remained a perfectly unified front, unbroken, unshaken. But in that one brief slip, their entire facade nearly crumbled. Why did Patsy say too much? Why did she bring up a second person who knows the truth? Why did she freeze? Why did John instantly intervene, without hesitation? Could it be that they knew far more than they ever admitted? Could it be that their lies weren't just to protect themselves, but to shield someone else inside that house? Watching that moment back, you don't see two grieving parents fighting to clear their names. You see two accomplices, two people terrified that one careless slip could shatter everything they've built. And perhaps the most disturbing thing is how effortlessly they handled it. That freeze in Patsy's voice, that look in John's eyes, that tiny click of his tongue. These weren't first-time mistakes. It almost feels like they've been through this before. And here lies the true question, not just what they were hiding that day, but how many other moments, across the years, have they let their masks slip, only for us to miss it. Maybe the truth isn't hidden in the grand speeches, or the teary confessions. Maybe it's right there in the smallest, most overlooked moments. The ones we weren't paying attention to, until now. But here's something even more unsettling. This wasn't the only time John and Patsy Ramsey showed signs of slipping. No. This moment was just the beginning. If you go back and watch their interviews, not just this one, but all of them over the years, you'll start to see a disturbing pattern.
Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, did either of you have anything to do with the death of your daughter?
No.
No. Mr. Ramsey, did you kill JonBenét?
No, I did not.
Mrs. Ramsey, did you kill your daughter?
No, I did not kill my daughter.
They repeat themselves constantly, almost like they're clinging to rehearsed lines. They rarely ever stray from certain phrases that feel carefully crafted to evoke sympathy, but ultimately reveal nothing. They say these lines again and again, regardless of the questions asked. Almost as if they aren't truly answering, but simply reciting. More than that, there's always an undercurrent of defensiveness. Even in moments when they're supposed to show grief or vulnerability, there's this sharp edge in their words. They bristle at suggestions that they might have done something wrong. They attack investigators. They attack the media. They shift the blame to anyone and everyone but themselves. That's not normal behavior for grieving parents. Most parents, when faced with a tragedy like this, will do anything to help investigators. They'll beg for information. They'll cooperate fully. They'll tear down their own walls just to find answers. But the Ramseys, they built walls higher and higher with every passing year. And that brings us back to one chilling truth. People who are innocent don't need to hide behind rehearsed statements. They don't need to police each other's words during interviews. They don't need to freeze glance and signal each other when the script is slipping. Because innocent people don't have a script. John and Patsy Ramsey did. And it wasn't just a script to protect their image. It wasn't just to protect their wealth, or their reputation, or their place in society. It was something far more insidious. It was a sweep signed to protect something or someone inside that house. Someone whose freedom, perhaps even their life, depended on both of them keeping that story straight. And here's the most disturbing possibility of all. Maybe the Ramseys weren't just protecting themselves. Maybe they were protecting a secret so dark that they were willing to lie, mislead, and deceive the entire world. All while staring into the camera, smiling faintly, and saying the same words we've heard for decades. We are innocent. But innocence doesn't look like this. And somewhere, buried beneath years of interviews, rehearsed answers, and subtle signals the truth has been hiding in plain sight. So now, the question isn't whether they lied. The real question is, what exactly were they lying to protect? Because behind that polished mask, something far uglier has been staring at us the whole time. Why did they lie? Before we can ever understand what they were trying to hide, we have to ask a far more disturbing question. Why did they lie in the first place? The answer isn't as simple as guilt or innocence. It's layered, complex. And when we peel back those layers, three chilling motives begin to take shape, motives that go far beyond just fear. The first is their obsession with maintaining the image of a perfect family. For years, the Ramseys sold themselves as the embodiment of success, wealthy, beautiful, admired. John, the accomplished businessman. Patsy, the former beauty queen. Together, they played the role of the American dream couple, flawless on the outside, untouchable within their community. To admit fault, to even show weakness, would shatter that illusion. For people like them, reputation wasn't just a matter of pride, it was currency. It meant influence, social power, respectability. And when that mask started to crack, their immediate instinct wasn't to grieve. It was to patch it up, to hold it together at all costs. But image wasn't the only thing they were protecting. The second motive was far more personal: self-preservation. John Ramsey wasn't just any father. He was a man who understood risk, leverage, and legal exposure. He knew what a criminal investigation could mean, not just for his freedom, but for his empire, his business, his wealth. If either of them admitted even a shred of culpability, the dominoes wouldn't just fall inside their home. They'd fall everywhere, through courtrooms, lawsuits, bankruptcy filings, public disgrace. And that's a price few people are willing to pay. Sometimes, lying isn't about hiding what you did. It's about protecting everything you still have. But perhaps the darkest motive of all was protection of another kind. The third possibility is as unsettling as it is unavoidable: that their lies weren't solely about themselves, but about someone else under their roof. Someone vulnerable. Someone they loved. Someone whose exposure would mean destruction not just for them, but for the entire family. Maybe it was Patsy. Maybe it was Burke. Maybe it was John himself. We don't know for certain. But every time they speak, every time they dodge a question, every time they tighten their story, you can feel it. They aren't just lying to the world. They're shielding something or someone that they've vowed to protect above all else. It's one thing to lie out of fear, but it's another thing entirely to lie out of strategy. Fear-driven lies are almost instinctive. People lie in panic, in desperation, because they're terrified of what might happen if they tell the truth. You can see it in their faces, their trembling hands, their frantic words. These lies are messy, chaotic, uncontrolled. But strategic lies, they're different. They are cold, precise, calculated. People who lie out of strategy aren't reacting to fear. They're working a plan. Every word, every pause, every glance is deliberate. They speak slowly, carefully, weighing every sentence before it leaves their mouths. They know exactly what to say and, more importantly, what not to say. That's what makes them so dangerous. Because when someone lies out of fear, it eventually shows. They slip up. They break down. The truth leaks out in panic. But people who lie out of strategy, they don't slip. They rehearse. They adjust. They watch each other closely. They make sure neither one says too much. They don't lie because they're scared of punishment. They lie because they're protecting something much bigger than themselves. And once you realize that, the question changes. It's no longer about whether they're lying. It's about why they're lying, and what exactly they're protecting with such ruthless precision. What stands out most about John and Patsy Ramsey is not only what they say, but how they say it. Their communication style is heavy with rehearsed restraint, never revealing genuine emotion. Even when devastation should consume them, they are asked about specific details from the crime only to respond with vague deflection. Well, we just don't recall that. We don't have any more to add. The result is endless repetition of hollow phrases like, "I don't know," and "I can't recall." These are not signs of genuine trauma. They are hallmark tactics of controlled deflection. They also meticulously rehearse unity. They present themselves as a unified front, no finger pointing, no contradiction, no misalignment even when questions should expose stress and crack their alliance. Instead, they reaffirm each other, never allowing any hint of tension to break through. That's not what honest grief looks like. Honest loss doesn't come with such a polished performance. Rather, what we're seeing is likely a deliberate strategy, one built on discipline, consistency, and mutual coordination. That coordination is more than love or loyalty. It's tactical. And at its core lies a chilling truth. These aren't grieving parents. These are accomplices in a story designed to protect something far more valuable than their peace of mind. There's something else, something even more disturbing, hidden in the way John and Patsy Ramsey speak. Beyond their carefully crafted words lies a pattern far more subtle. When under pressure, they start changing how they refer to JonBenét. At first, they call her, or little girl, or precious daughter. It sounds sweet, personal, like grieving parents. But the moment questioning intensifies, they shift. Suddenly, JonBenét becomes she, or worse, the child. It's subtle, but it matters. Psychologists call this distancing language, a quiet attempt to separate themselves emotionally from what happened. They stop speaking as parents. They start speaking as outsiders. And it doesn't end there. Their voices shift, too. Patsy's tone often rises when she's cornered. Her words spill out fast, shaky, and louder than before. She sprinkles phrases like, "I swear," and "honestly," trying to force sincerity where none exists. Then just as suddenly her voice drops. She looks away. Her eye contact breaks. These aren't random slips. These are classic signs of vocal stress common in deception. They also speak as if they're spectators, not victims. Phrases like, "This family has been through enough," or "This tragedy has torn apart lives," sound detached. They talk about themselves as if they're watching from the outside, carefully avoiding personal, raw connections to the crime. You won't hear them say things like, "I miss her," or "I wish she was still here." Instead, they say things like, "She's in God's hands now," or "We've left it to the authorities." They bury their personal grief under layers of generic, spiritual platitudes, another way to sidestep real emotion. And there's something else missing, something most grieving parents instinctively express: a future. You'll never hear them speak about JonBenét's birthdays or memories they wish they could relive. They never imagine a future where they find peace or healing. All they focus on is the case itself, the investigation, the media, the blame. When they do express frustration, it's rarely about losing their daughter. It's about everything else. They attack the police. They blame the media. They complain about the town. They shift the spotlight onto anyone but themselves. It's what psychologists call deflecting guilt outward to avoid facing the truth within. Taken together, all these habits, distancing language, vocal shifts, detached phrasing, future avoidance, constant blame, paint a chilling picture. Because these aren't just people hiding something. These are people who've spent years perfecting how to hide it. In the end, what remains most disturbing about John and Patsy Ramsey isn't just their words or even their lies. It's the way they move together. Not as grieving parents, but as two people protecting the same secret. They act less like a shattered mother and father and more like partners in deception. Their unity is too perfect, too seamless, too rehearsed to be natural. They don't just finish each other's sentences. They watch each other carefully, making sure neither says too much. They adjust mid-conversation. They anticipate each other's mistakes. It's not grief we're watching. It's a performance. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the moment Patsy let her guard down, when she said, "There are at least two people on the face of this earth who know who did this." In that brief instant, their perfect mask almost slipped. Because by admitting that, Patsy didn't just acknowledge that a killer existed. She revealed that there was a second person involved, or at the very least, that she believed there was. That wasn't fear. That wasn't panic. That was something else entirely. And the question that still lingers, after all these years, is no longer about whether they were lying. It's about who they were protecting all along. Their daughter's memory, their carefully guarded family name, or simply themselves. True motive, who are they really protecting? As we move forward, the question we need to ask is no longer simply what they were hiding. That's no longer enough. Now, we must ask, who were they protecting? Was it JonBenét's memory, their daughter's innocence preserved at all costs? Was it the pristine image of their family, their carefully cultivated reputation in the eyes of the public, neighbors, and the media? Or was it themselves? Their freedom, their wealth, their status, their safety. This is where everything shifts. This is where we stop focusing on the lies themselves and start asking why those lies were told in the first place. Because lies, by nature, are never random. Every lie has a target, someone they're meant to shield, someone they're meant to protect from the fallout. And in the Ramsey case, that question, who exactly were they protecting, may unlock the darkest truth of all. One of the darkest, yet most straightforward possibilities in this case is that John and Patsy Ramsey weren't protecting anyone else at all. No unknown intruder. No outside threat. The harsh reality may be this: they were protecting themselves. And when you truly think about it, this scenario explains their every move, every word, every carefully rehearsed statement. Because they knew deep down, from the very beginning, that if the full truth ever came to light, their lives as they knew them would be over. The consequences wouldn't just be emotional, they would be devastating in every way imaginable. We're talking about the complete destruction of everything they valued. Legal prosecution, prison time, total public humiliation, financial ruin, the loss of their home, their careers, their status, and perhaps worst of all, the complete obliteration of the flawless, upper-class image they had spent their entire adult lives building. In their world, admitting fault wasn't just about accountability, it was about annihilation. And so, everything they did from that night forward appeared to center around one goal: survival. Self-preservation. Protecting what they had left. In every interview, every press statement, every public appearance, their strategy was remarkably consistent. Their words were never truly focused on justice for their daughter. They were focused on clearing themselves. Listen closely, and almost every answer they give revolves around denying personal responsibility. They carefully avoid acknowledging even the smallest mistakes. They never admit to any error in judgment. Not in how they handled the ransom note. Not in how they allowed people to walk through the crime scene. Not in how John himself moved the body, an action that would later be heavily criticized by investigators. Instead, they downplay it all. They dismiss those mistakes as minor misunderstandings, or irrelevant details, or simply things they don't recall. They repeat, over and over again, that they did everything they could, that they were victims of bad police work, media harassment, and small-town rumors. But the most revealing pattern is how they evade any question about their personal actions on the night of JonBenét's death. Whenever they're asked about specific behaviors, where they were at certain times, who did what exactly happened after the 911 call, they become vague, defensive, or outright dismissive. They dodge the details. They turn the focus elsewhere, often blaming the police, the press, or mysterious siders. They lean on their lawyers, claiming they've been advised not to speak freely, and they stick to the same phrases: "I've already told everything we know. We don't remember. Can't recall." It's not just evasiveness, it's intentional. Because in their minds, every detail is dangerous. Every admission, no matter how small, could unravel everything. It isn't confusion. It's calculated risk management. The reality is, John and Patsy were not ordinary grieving parents. They were people with enormous wealth, status, and social influence. They understood how power worked. They knew how to use attorneys, public relations teams, and media appearances to shape the narrative. And it seems clear that they knew the biggest threat wasn't a media frenzy or even a police investigation, it was the truth about what really happened that night. Because the truth, whatever it may be, would mean total collapse. They would lose everything. Their freedom, their family, their legacy. And so, they locked themselves into a pact of self-preservation, one where neither would ever admit to wrongdoing, where both would protect the other at all costs, and where every public appearance would serve the same purpose: to maintain control of the narrative. It wasn't about finding a killer. It wasn't about justice for JonBenét. It was about protecting themselves. And that, more than anything else, explains their relentless focus on denying every allegation, evading every question, and preserving their image no matter the cost. Because when everything is on the line, when your life, your fortune, and your very identity are at risk, self-preservation becomes the only story you're willing to tell. There's another theory, one far more unsettling, but impossible to ignore. It's the idea that everything the Ramseys did after that night wasn't just about protecting themselves. It was about protecting their son, Burke. He was only 9 years old at the time, a child, yes, but old enough to act impulsively, old enough to lash out without understanding the consequences of his actions. In this theory, Burke is not seen as a cold-blooded killer, but as a child who may have lost control in a flash of anger or jealousy. A tragic accident. A moment of sibling rivalry gone horribly wrong. And faced with that horrifying possibility, John and Patsy would have had to make an unimaginable decision: protect their son, or watch their entire family be destroyed. They chose protection. And here's where this theory becomes even more chilling. The Ramseys had both the means and the power to pull it off. This wasn't an ordinary family. John Ramsey was wealthy, connected, and highly respected in his community. Patsy had deep social ties. They had resources attorneys, PR specialists, private investigators. They had the ability to shield Burke from serious scrutiny in a way that most families never could. And they used it. From the very beginning, the Ramseys were extremely protective of Burke's image, even before the media or police raised questions about his potential involvement. John and Patsy repeatedly and almost obsessively insisted that Burke was innocent. In fact, they often brought up Burke's innocence unprompted, as if trying to preempt suspicion before it even arose. That alone raises questions. Why mention it so forcefully when nobody had asked? Then there's the way they carefully shaped the narrative around Burke's actions that night. Patsy, in particular, was known for repeating a very specific phrase across multiple interviews. Burke slept through everything. She said it so often, it became almost like a mantra. According to her, Burke wasn't awake when the ransom note was found. He wasn't awake during the 911 call. He wasn't awake while police flooded the house. He wasn't awake during the hours when his sister's body lay hidden in the basement. In every telling, Burke was always asleep, always absent from the story. But the more you hear it, the more unnatural it begins to sound. Because in reality, it's almost impossible for a child to sleep through that level of chaos in the home. The frantic voices, the screaming, the police arriving, the lights on in every room. And yet, according to John and Patsy, Burke was completely unaware, protected by the convenient shield of sleep. Even beyond their words, their actions with Burke raised questions. Throughout the entire investigation, they went to great lengths to limit Burke's exposure to law enforcement and the media. They controlled who spoke to him. They restricted interviews. They tightly managed every piece of information released about him. Burke was kept out of the spotlight, hidden away, shielded by lawyers and family spokespeople. To this day, even decades later, many people are surprised by how little was publicly known about Burke during those early weeks, almost as if he had been erased from the narrative entirely. And when you start connecting these dots, a disturbing picture begins to form. A picture of a family using every resource, every ounce of influence, to protect the one person they believe couldn't survive what really happened. Not because he was evil, not because he had intended harm, but because he was their son. Because admitting the truth about Burke would have meant destroying their entire world. And, when faced with that choice, they seemed to make it without hesitation. That's what makes this theory so difficult to dismiss. It explains why the Ramseys were so quick to align their stories, why they were so fiercely protective of Burke, why they refused to allow him to be questioned openly, and why their entire narrative was carefully constructed to keep him invisible in the public eye. Because if Burke had been responsible, even accidentally, the Ramseys knew there would be no turning back. No forgiveness from the public, no way to reclaim their image, no way to live with the weight of what happened. And so, they did what many parents might do in their most desperate, darkest moments. They protected their child. At all costs. There is one more theory, perhaps the most unsettling of them all. It doesn't involve protecting a child. It doesn't hinge on some unknown intruder. It's the possibility that John and Patsy weren't just protecting themselves, or their son, but each other. In this version of events, everything changes. It's not about shielding an outsider or an accident by a child. It's about covering up something far more calculated within their own marriage. This theory suggests that one of them may have been directly responsible for what happened to JonBenét, whether through a moment of uncontrolled rage, a tragic accident, or something darker, and that the other decided to help cover it up. Not out of malice, not out of fear of the law, but out of loyalty, out of desperation, out of a shared need to survive. In this scenario, the entire narrative we've heard from them begins to make sense, but for very different reasons. The ransom note, bizarre in its length and detail, suddenly looks less like the work of a stranger and more like a deliberate, joint fabrication, a letter written together, in panic, but with enough calculation to redirect suspicion elsewhere. The carefully staged crime scene begins to look like the product of two people working together, both with something to lose, both terrified of the consequences. Even their behavior in public, their carefully matched statements, their synchronized body language, their shared glances starts to seem less like coincidence and more like coordination. There are signs, subtle but undeniable, that they had reached a quiet, unspoken agreement to protect each other at all costs. In every interview, they follow a strict pattern: never contradict each other, never correct each other in a way that would raise suspicion. They stay locked in sync, mirroring each other's emotions, echoing the same talking points, and avoiding any cracks that might let the truth slip through. And yet, behind that polished front, there are occasional glimpses of something else. A shared glance here, a subtle hand gesture there, micro-expressions, small, fleeting looks of tension when one of them strays too close to dangerous territory. It's in these moments that you see the real story playing out, not through their words, but through their eyes, their body language, their unconscious reactions. It's the look of two people who've rehearsed their story too many times. Two people who can finish each other's sentences, not because they're soulmates, but because they have to. Two people who understand that the moment one of them falls apart, the other goes down with them. Throughout all their appearances, they've carefully reinforced their image as a resilient, united couple, emphasizing their shared grief, their joint suffering, their unwavering support for each other. But beneath that carefully constructed facade, this theory suggests something very different: a desperate alliance, bound not by love, but by mutual guilt and by the terrifying knowledge that they can only survive if they both remain silent. In the end, it all comes back to the same chilling question: what would you do to protect the person you love most, if it meant saving yourself as well? For John and Patsy Ramsey, the answer may have been everything. And now, we've reached the point where every theory, every possibility, leads to one unavoidable question. Perhaps the question isn't who committed this crime anymore. Maybe that's not the mystery that needs solving. Maybe the real question, the one that's been staring us in the face for decades, is much darker, much harder to face. Just how far were they willing to go to protect their secret? How far would they go to bury the truth, not just from the police, not just from the media, but from everyone, even themselves? Because at this stage, The focus isn't just about the crime itself. It's about the lengths two people would go to in order to keep something hidden forever. If they really did cover this up together, if every glance, every whispered correction, every carefully rehearsed statement was part of a mutual pact, then it begs an even deeper, more terrifying question: what exactly was at stake? What was so catastrophic, so unthinkable, that they believed the only way forward was to build an elaborate wall of lies around it? Was it about saving their freedom, their wealth, their social status? Or was it about something even more personal, something darker that we've yet to fully comprehend? This is the point where the case stops being just another unsolved murder. It becomes something else entirely. It becomes a story of obsession, of control, of people willing to sacrifice anything to protect their carefully crafted world, even at the cost of the truth. And in that story, the line between victim and perpetrator begins to blur, because the question isn't simply who caused JonBenét's death. It's what they were protecting when they chose to hide it. And as we move forward, that's the question we must keep asking. Not just who committed the crime, but why they were so determined to keep it buried. Because sometimes, the real secret isn't the crime itself. It's what people are willing to do to keep it hidden. A cold marriage, a hidden truth. For years, the image of the Ramsey family remained frozen in the public's mind, an almost storybook portrait of American success. A wealthy, respected father, a former beauty queen mother, 2 beautiful children, a perfect home. They were everything the public wanted to believe in: polished, prosperous, deeply rooted in their faith and their community. On the surface, they appeared to be the embodiment of the American dream, a family admired not just for their fortune, but for their seemingly close bond and wholesome reputation. But as we peel back the layers of that carefully crafted image, another picture begins to emerge, one that's far colder, far more fractured. Beneath the polished surface, the Ramseys were not the perfect family they appeared to be. Behind the closed doors of their grand home, theirs was a household defined not by warmth or closeness, but by distance, tension, and quiet resentment. Their lives weren't built on love and harmony, they were built on control, appearances, and silent fractures. At the center of it all was a marriage riddled with cracks. John and Patsy Ramsey had long struggled behind the scenes, locked in a relationship that was more about survival than affection. Patsy was known for her high-strung personality, controlling, anxious, emotionally unstable. Her obsession with appearances wasn't limited to beauty pageants. It spilled into every corner of her life, including her relentless need to manage her household, her children, and even her husband. She was described by those who knew her as volatile, unpredictable, and often difficult to please. John, on the other hand, was a man of secrets. Quiet, reserved, deeply private, even within his own home. His social circles were complicated, filled with business dealings, powerful friends, and whispers of personal affairs that few dared to speak about publicly. He had learned long ago how to compartmentalize, how to keep parts of his life hidden, even from those closest to him. And within their marriage, he wielded control not through emotional outbursts, but through silence and detachment. Those closest to the family saw the truth long before the public did. Their former housekeeper, Linda Hoffman-Pugh, later described the Ramsey household as cold, tense, and unsettling. She spoke of an environment where appearances mattered more than connection, where every day felt like walking on eggshells. Another close family friend, Susan Stein, echoed the same observations. She described the Ramseys as distant, fractured, and anything but the loving, cohesive unit they projected to the world. Inside that home, everything revolved around maintaining the illusion. They weren't just hiding personal flaws, they were hiding deep, festering dysfunction. And that dysfunction wasn't new. It didn't begin with the murder of JonBenét. It had been there for years, buried beneath layers of social status, wealth, and denial. And so the question becomes inevitable: were John and Patsy simply protecting themselves from legal consequences? Or were they protecting something even deeper? Something far more personal? Were they hiding not just the details of a crime, but the truth about a marriage and a family that had been broken long before that tragic night? Behind every polished family portrait, there is often one person pulling the strings, quiet, calculating, always in control. In the Ramsey case, that person may well have been John Ramsey. While much of the public focus has long been placed on Patsy, the emotional mother, the pageant-obsessed parent, there's another figure lurking in the background. A man who speaks calmly, answers carefully, and rarely lets emotion cloud his words. But beneath that calm exterior lies something far more unsettling: an obsession with control. John Ramsey wasn't just a grieving father or a wealthy businessman. He was a man used to running empires, controlling employees, steering companies, managing crises. And, according to many who've studied his behavior, that same need for dominance extended far beyond his business dealings. It infiltrated his home, his marriage, and, some believe, even the cover-up that followed JonBenét's death. Throughout every interview, John exhibits the same consistent pattern. He speaks only when necessary, always with measured words. He avoids direct answers, especially when the topic turns to the night of the murder. He redirects. He sidesteps. He carefully constructs his responses to maintain a safe distance from anything that could implicate him directly. And the theories surrounding his true motives are as chilling as they are plausible. Some believe John's sole focus was self-protection, shielding himself from potential allegations of sexual abuse. Allegations that have circulated in the darkest corners of this case for decades, though never officially proven. Others suspect something even more calculated: that John subtly allowed Patsy to carry the public burden of suspicion, leveraging her emotional instability and vulnerability to deflect attention from himself. In this theory, Patsy becomes the sacrificial pawn, emotionally fragile, easily manipulated, and ultimately blamed by many for the tragedy. But John's actions also suggest a third, equally unsettling possibility: that his primary goal was to protect Burke at all costs. As the heir to his fortune, Burke represented not only the continuation of John's family name, but also the preservation of everything he had worked for. By shielding Burke, John wasn't just protecting a son, he was protecting his entire legacy. And through it all, John remained the quiet puppeteer guiding the narrative, controlling the story, ensuring that every public statement served his personal interests. But the most disturbing signs of John's control aren't found in what he says. They're found in what he refuses to say and how he positions himself during every interaction. His interviews reveal a man who speaks with chilling precision, who consistently answers in ways that benefit himself, even at the cost of others, especially Patsy. Time and again, his words subtly shift responsibility away from himself, placing Patsy in increasingly vulnerable positions. He never directly blames her, of course, but the undertones are unmistakable. His cold, unflinching demeanor speaks volumes. He shows little remorse, little sadness, only a relentless focus on maintaining control. His calculated responses, his tightly controlled body language, and his unyielding denials suggest not just innocence, but strategy. Every answer seems rehearsed, every expression carefully measured. Some experts believe John's behavior points to something even darker, that he may have been orchestrating the entire narrative from the beginning. The ransom note, the carefully managed media appearances, the coordinated legal strategy, all of it bearing the hallmarks of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate a situation for personal gain. And the question that lingers is chilling: did John Ramsey, from the very start, take control of this tragedy, not to find justice, but to protect himself and those he chose to shield? Because in the end, this may not simply be a story about a murdered child or a grieving family. It may be a story about power, and about a man willing to do anything to keep it. And now, as we step back and look at the full picture, we're left with a far more unsettling question. What if this case has never really been just about the murder of JonBenét Ramsey? What if the true story hiding beneath it all has always been something far more complicated, far more personal? What if, behind the headlines and media chaos, behind the tearful interviews and televised pleas, this has always been the story of a family that had already broken long before that night. A family fractured by resentment, control, secrets, and emotional distance. A family that had learned how to hide its cracks beneath a polished surface for years. Because when you look closely, this begins to feel less like a crime and more like a performance. Every press conference, every TV appearance, every carefully worded statement, each one feels like another act in a script. A script designed not to find truth or justice, but to protect a narrative, to shield reputations, to preserve power. And at the very center of that performance, one figure remained steady, calm, calculated, and always in control: John Ramsey. And so the question we must now ask is no longer, who killed JonBenét? It's far more haunting than that. If the truth has never really been about a murder, if it has always been about a family already broken beyond repair, then maybe this has never been about justice at all. Maybe this has always been about something else entirely, a perfectly staged performance. Directed by John Ramsey himself. The Husband's Hidden Truth. There's a question that lingers beneath every carefully chosen word, every rehearsed statement, every controlled reaction John Ramsey has made throughout the years. Was this ever really about protecting his family, or was it always about protecting himself? When you study his behavior closely, it's impossible to ignore the unmistakable signs of a man obsessed with control. From the very beginning, John Ramsey has exhibited one defining trait: an unwavering need to control everything around him. His career was built on it. His image depended on it. And after that fateful night, his entire survival strategy seemed to center on it. John wasn't like other grieving fathers. He didn't break down in tears on national television. He didn't stumble through interviews, grasping for words in despair. Instead, he remained calm, composed, precise. He spoke carefully, always choosing his words with meticulous caution, as if calculating their long-term impact with every breath. And what stands out most isn't just what John said, it's what he consistently refused to say. In every interview, he steered away from specific questions about the events of that night. He avoided timelines. He sidestepped personal details. He turned vague when asked about his movements, his choices, his actions. And every time he was pressed for answers, his focus wasn't on grief or confusion. It was on preserving his position. Some of the darkest theories surrounding John suggest that this wasn't just about self-preservation in the traditional sense. There have long been whispers in the shadows of this case, whispers of something far more sinister. Allegations, though never proven, that hint at the possibility of sexual abuse within the household. Allegations that John's every move, every defensive wall, every deflection has been designed to shield himself from facing those accusations head-on. Whether or not these theories hold truth, there is no denying one thing: John Ramsey's behavior fits the pattern of someone protecting themselves first. But others see something even more calculated at play. Many experts believe that John's true strategy may have been even more ruthless. That from the very beginning, he recognized Patsy's emotional fragility, her instability, her desperation to hold the family together, and deliberately positioned her as the emotional shield. That he allowed Patsy to carry the weight of public suspicion, knowing that her overwrought personality and past could easily make her a scapegoat. In this version of events, John wasn't just protecting, he was using his wife as a buffer, knowingly placing her between himself and the line of fire. And then, there's the third possibility, perhaps the most unsettling of all. The theory that John's ultimate goal wasn't simply to shield himself or Patsy, but to protect Burke. His son, his heir, his legacy. If Burke was responsible, whether through an accident, an outburst, or something more deliberate, John would have been faced with a devastating choice: turn his son over to authorities, or protect him at all costs. And every move John has made since that night suggests that his choice was clear. He kept Burke out of the public eye. He limited Burke's interactions with police. He directed attention away from Burke at every opportunity. not just as a father protecting his child, but as a man protecting his entire empire. What makes John's behavior even more alarming is that, in every public statement, every interview, every piece of testimony, his words consistently serve one purpose: to benefit himself. His denials are firm. His answers are polished. And time after time, his statements subtly shift blame in one direction toward Patsy. He never explicitly points the finger. He doesn't need to. The implication is always there, lurking between the lines. John's cold, calculated demeanor is impossible to regret. He doesn't show sadness. He shows strategy. His body language is controlled. His tone is even. His gaze rarely wavers. Every word feels rehearsed. Every response carefully measured. He behaves less like a man mourning his daughter, and more like a man managing a crisis. Many investigators have pointed to this behavior as evidence that John may have been the architect of the entire cover, up from the very beginning. That he wasn't merely swept up in Patsy's hysteria, but was, in fact, directing it. The ransom note written in the house on Patsy's notepad bears all the marks of a planned diversion, possibly dictated or orchestrated by John himself. The way he manipulated the media, the precision with which he handled lawyers, and the consistency of his narrative all suggest a man who knew exactly how to control a narrative to his advantage. And perhaps the most chilling realization is this: in every step of this case, John's actions have been tailored to protect himself, first and foremost. Whether it meant sacrificing Patsy's reputation, shielding Burke, or steering the public's attention away from the most uncomfortable questions, John's priority has remained unchanged. Control. Preserve the empire. Keep the truth buried. Because at the core of it all, this may not have been about finding a killer or protecting a family. It may have been about a man doing whatever it takes to protect his own legacy and himself. And this leads us to perhaps the most dangerous illusion of all, the illusion of honesty. John Ramsey has always presented himself as the calm, steady figure in the storm. He doesn't shout. He doesn't panic. He speaks with quiet restraint, measured and reasonable. He appears logical, rational, even humble at times. But beneath that soft, spoken exterior lies something far more unsettling: a man who has everything to gain by appearing harmless. Because there is a certain power in being seen as the honest one, the calm husband, the grieving father, the man simply caught in an unimaginable tragedy. That image earns sympathy. It earns trust. And it deflects suspicion. While the public focused on Patsy, her dramatic personality, her breakdowns, her obsession with appearances, John stayed in the background, quietly reinforcing the idea that he was just trying to hold everything together. But this narrative conveniently overlooks how often his calmness has worked to his advantage. Throughout every interview, every legal deposition, every media appearance, John's words are carefully crafted to seem reasonable. But they are always, without exception, words that serve his best interest. He never loses control. He never reveals more than necessary. And most importantly, he consistently shapes the story in ways that protect himself, often at the expense of others. And here's the uncomfortable truth: sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one who screams or cries or lashes out. Sometimes, it's the one who stays quiet. The one who watches everything. The one who plans every word with surgical precision. John Ramsey has played the role of the reasonable man for decades. But what if that was the most strategic role of all? What if, all along, the man everyone called the honest one was simply the best liar in the room? And as we move deeper into this case, we have to ask ourselves what other secrets might still be buried beneath John Ramsey's calm exterior. What else has been carefully edited, filtered, or erased from the public eye, hidden behind that soft voice and composed face? Because if there's one thing this story has taught us, it's that appearances mean nothing here. The question we now face isn't just about John Ramsey's involvement in the crime. It's about what else he's been protecting, what else he's been controlling, and most importantly, what happens when that final mask slips. In the next chapter, we'll peel back another layer of this case, one that many refuse to discuss, one that brings us face to face with the darkest theories surrounding the Ramsey family, and forces us to ask, was this ever about justice? Or has it always been about something else entirely? We've spent so much time asking who killed JonBenét Ramsey. But maybe that's been the wrong question all along. Because beneath every theory, beneath every headline, beneath every televised plea for answers, there lies something far more sinister, something most people have been too afraid to face. Not just a crime, not just a cover-up, but a deeper rotten beneath decades of silence. A truth about power, about manipulation, about what people are willing to do not just to hide a crime, but to protect everything else they fear losing. And at the center of it all, once again, we find John Ramsey. In this next chapter, we'll explore the darkest theories surrounding the Ramsey family. The theories few dare to speak aloud. And the uncomfortable question that keeps resurfacing, no matter how many times people try to bury it. What if JonBenét wasn't the only victim in that house? What if she was simply the most visible one? The truth of the perfect family. In the end, after every interview is dissected, every headline analyzed, and every theory laid bare, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The Ramseys were never the victims of the media. They were never a flawless, wholesome family caught in an unfair storm of publicity. That illusion, the picture, perfect family with their smiles frozen in holiday cards and pageant stages, was exactly that, an illusion. Because from the very beginning, this wasn't the story of a grieving family fighting for justice. It was the story of people fighting to protect something far more precious to them than the truth. It was about power, control, and survival at any cost. They weren't victims of a media witch hunt. They weren't scapegoats. They were the architects of their own narrative, carefully, deliberately crafting their version of events to maintain their image, their standing, and their control. And that's the hardest truth to accept in this entire case. That every tearful interview, every shaky voice, every plea for help wasn't about finding a killer. It was about deflecting attention. It was about buying time. It was about protecting what mattered most to them. Not their daughter's memory, but their carefully constructed empire. Because when you strip away the press conferences, the documentaries, and the endless speculation, one fact becomes chillingly clear. This was a family willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to keep their secrets safe. Even their own daughter. They showed the world how far they were willing to go. They lied. They deflected. They manipulated every camera, every courtroom, every microphone. They allowed the media to paint Patsy as unstable, let suspicion quietly creep toward her, all while John sat back controlled, calculating, untouched by the same level of scrutiny. They distanced Burke from it all, hiding him behind locked doors and legal teams, erasing him from the narrative before the public could even ask questions. They shut down anyone who tried to get too close. And through it all, they presented themselves as a united front, a grieving couple simply seeking justice. But behind closed doors, every move they made was cold, strategic, and self-serving. They weren't just preserving their freedom. They weren't just avoiding prison. They were preserving their lifestyle, their wealth, their legacy, and perhaps most disturbing of all, their power. Because if the truth ever came out, if the world truly knew what went on behind the doors of that grand house, their entire world would collapse. So they fought to protect it, relentlessly, at any cost. And now, decades later, we're left staring at the same haunting question we've been asking since the very beginning. Will the truth inside the Ramsey home ever be exposed? Will we ever really know what happened that night? Or has this case already become something far more terrifying? Not just an unsolved murder, not just a cold case, but a cautionary tale, a story about the power of image, the reach of wealth, and the chilling reality that sometimes the most perfect families tell the most perfect lies. Because maybe this was never about justice. Maybe it was always about something else entirely. A lie so carefully crafted, so deeply embedded, that it became untouchable. A lie that allowed them to keep everything. A lie that turned JonBenét into not just a victim, but the ultimate sacrifice. So we're left with one final question, one that will haunt this case forever. Was this ever truly a mystery about who killed JonBenét Ramsey? Or has it always been about the people who were willing to do anything to protect everything? Some stories end with justice. This one ends with silence. No arrests. No confessions. No closure. Just a little girl lost, a case that grew colder with every passing year, and a family that walked away untouched. If the truth still lives inside that house, behind those carefully guarded walls, we may never hear it. But in a case built on secrets, sometimes the silence tells us everything.